September 3rd, 1987, and the small Kentucky town of Hazard was preparing for the Labor Day weekend, with families shopping at the farmers market held every Thursday in the courthouse square downtown. The market occupied several blocks with vendors selling produce, crafts, and baked goods under colorful tents, and on this warm Thursday afternoon over 200 people browsed the stalls enjoying the end of summer weather. Lillian Moore was 6 years old that day, a kindergartner with curly black hair tied with ribbons, dark brown eyes, and a shy demeanor that made her stay close to her mother in crowded places. She wore pink overalls over a white t-shirt with a unicorn on the front, white sandals with buckles, and she carried a small stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons that she took everywhere. Lillian had come to the market with her mother, Patricia Moore, a single parent who worked as a waitress at the local diner and was shopping for vegetables and bread to stretch her tight budget. Patricia had been carefully selecting tomatoes at Helen's produce stand at approximately 3:45 p.m., and Lillian stood beside her holding Mr. Buttons and watching people walk past the stall. The produce stand was positioned on Main Street with good visibility, surrounded by other vendor tents and with the courthouse visible just across the street, and Patricia felt comfortable letting Lillian stand right next to her. At 3:48 p.m., another customer asked Patricia a question about where to find fresh corn, and Patricia turned to point toward a vendor 2 stalls down, a conversation that lasted maybe 15 to 20 seconds. When Patricia turned back to continue selecting tomatoes, Lillian was no longer standing beside her, and the small gap where her daughter had been was empty, except for crowds of people moving between vendor stalls. Patricia's first reaction was confusion rather than panic, thinking Lillian had stepped a few feet away to look at something, and she called her daughter's name while checking the immediate area around the produce stand. But seconds became a minute, and Lillian didn't respond to Patricia's increasingly frantic calls, and Patricia began asking other shoppers if they'd seen a 6-year-old girl in pink overalls with a stuffed rabbit. The vendor Helen and several customers helped Patricia search the area around the produce stand, checking between tents and asking people if they'd seen which direction Lillian had gone, but nobody had noticed her leave. By 3:55 p.m., Patricia was screaming for help, and market organizers were making announcements over the loudspeaker, asking Lillian Moore to come to the information booth and requesting all adults watch for a missing child. Within minutes, dozens of people were searching the market area, checking inside vendor trucks, behind displays, and anywhere a 6-year-old might have wandered while her mother's attention was briefly diverted. In approximately 15 to 20 seconds, while her mother answered another customer's question 3 feet away, 6-year-old Lillian Moore vanished from a crowded farmer's market in broad daylight without anyone seeing where she went. If you want to hear how this little girl was finally found alive after 37 years, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's see what happened. Hazard police arrived at 4:05 p.m., and Officer David Martinez immediately coordinated a systematic search of the downtown area, checking every building and business within a 3-block radius of the courthouse square. The market was essentially shut down with vendors asked to stay in place while police checked every vehicle attempting to leave the area, looking for any sign of Lillian or suspicious behavior. Patricia was interviewed about what Lillian had been wearing and whether she'd seemed upset or mentioned wanting to go anywhere, and Patricia insisted her daughter had been happy and standing calmly beside her. Mr. Buttons, Lillian's stuffed rabbit, was found on the ground near Helen's produce stand at 4:15 p.m., and this discovery troubled investigators because Lillian never went anywhere without that rabbit. "She sleeps with Mr. Buttons, carries him everywhere," Patricia sobbed. "She wouldn't have dropped him willingly. Someone must have grabbed her and she dropped it. Oh God, someone took my baby." The location where the rabbit was found became the starting point for investigation, and officers examined the area for any physical evidence or witnesses who might have seen what happened in those critical seconds. Several people remembered seeing Patricia and Lillian at the produce stand, but nobody could recall seeing the child after approximately 3:47 p.m., and nobody had witnessed her being taken or walking away. The produce stand was positioned with its back toward an alley that ran behind the buildings on Main Street, and this alley provided access to a small parking area used by vendors and business owners. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 4:30 p.m. and immediately focused on this alley as a potential route someone could have used to quickly remove Lillian from the market without being seen by the crowd. Bloodhounds arrived from Lexington by 6 p.m. and were given Lillian's scent from clothing Patricia had in her car, and the dogs tracked from the produce stand directly into the alley behind Main Street before losing the trail. The fact that the scent ended in the alley suggested Lillian had been placed in a vehicle there, and investigators began the massive task of identifying every car that had been parked in or near that area during the market. Detective Chen interviewed vendors whose stalls had been near Helen's produce, asking if anyone had noticed suspicious people or vehicles in the alley during the afternoon, but most had been focused on customers and hadn't paid attention to the alley. One vendor named Margaret Wilson mentioned that she'd seen a woman with long brown hair walking quickly through the alley around 3:50 p.m., carrying what looked like a bundle, but she hadn't thought anything of it at the time. "I just assumed it was someone carrying purchases to their car," Margaret explained. "The woman seemed in a hurry, but that wasn't unusual, and I didn't see clearly what she was carrying because my view was partially blocked." This information about a woman in the alley became a critical lead, and police immediately began searching for witnesses who might have seen this person more clearly or noticed what vehicle she'd gotten into. The theory emerged that Lillian had been grabbed during those 15 seconds when Patricia's back was turned, carried quickly into the alley just steps away, and placed in a waiting vehicle before anyone realized what was happening. But this theory required someone who'd been watching and waiting for precisely that opportunity, someone who understood that Patricia would be distracted and that the alley provided a quick escape route. FBI Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from Louisville on Friday morning and brought resources for what was now officially being treated as a child abduction under federal jurisdiction. Agent Wells interviewed Patricia extensively about her life and relationships, looking for anyone who might have motive to take Lillian, but Patricia was a single mother with no custody disputes or concerning ex-partners. Lillian's biological father had died in a car accident when she was 2 years old, and Patricia had no current romantic relationships or conflicts with anyone who would want to harm her by taking her daughter. The case generated intense media coverage across Kentucky, with Lillian's photo appearing on television and in newspapers, her curly hair and shy smile becoming an image that thousands of people recognized. Tips flooded in from across the state with people claiming to have seen Lillian at gas stations and restaurants. But every reported sighting was investigated and found to be other children with similar features. By mid-September, the intensive search had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Lillian, despite extensive investigation, and the farmer's market moved to a different location, unable to continue in the place where a child had been stolen. Patricia quit her job at the diner and devoted every waking hour to searching for Lillian, distributing flyers and organizing volunteer search parties that continued for months, checking rural areas around Hazard. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in early 1988, and the broadcast included a dramatic recreation of Lillian's disappearance and interviews with Patricia pleading for her daughter's return. One tip that came from the Unsolved Mysteries broadcast seemed promising. A woman in Tennessee reported that her neighbor had suddenly acquired a young daughter in September 1987, claiming she'd adopted the child privately. The neighbor was identified as Carol Henderson, a 42-year-old woman who lived alone in a small town near Nashville, and she'd introduced the girl she was calling Emma to neighbors in late September 1987. FBI agents visited Henderson's home and questioned her about Emma's background, and Henderson provided documents claiming the child had been adopted through a private arrangement with a woman who couldn't care for her. But when agents asked to verify the adoption paperwork and interview the biological mother, Henderson's story began falling apart, and she became defensive and evasive about providing details. Emma, who appeared to be about 6 years old, was interviewed carefully by social workers, and the child seemed confused about her history, saying she remembered living somewhere else before, but couldn't recall details clearly. The child had dark curly hair similar to Lillian's, but Henderson claimed Emma's mother had been Caucasian, and the girl's darker features were from her biological father, who was Hispanic. DNA testing wasn't widely available or reliable in 1988, so investigators had to rely on physical identification and circumstantial evidence to determine if Emma might be Lillian Moore. Patricia was brought to Tennessee to see Emma in person, and while the child bore some resemblance to Lillian, Patricia couldn't be certain after several months had passed, and the trauma of the situation clouded her judgment. Emma didn't react to seeing Patricia or recognize her, and when shown Mr. Buttons the stuffed rabbit, she seemed confused and said she'd never seen it before, responses that suggested she might not be Lillian after all. Henderson's adoption documents were examined by forensic specialists, and while they appeared suspicious and potentially fraudulent, investigators couldn't definitively prove they were fake or that Emma was actually Lillian Moore. Without DNA testing to confirm identity, and with Emma not recognizing Patricia or showing any signs of remembering her previous life, authorities reluctantly concluded they couldn't prove the child was the missing Kentucky girl. Henderson was investigated for potential adoption fraud, but she had witnesses who supported her story about receiving Emma from a woman in financial distress, and without concrete evidence of kidnapping, prosecutors couldn't file charges. Emma remained with Henderson while the investigation continued, and this decision haunted Patricia for decades afterward, believing that her daughter had been right there, but authorities couldn't prove it and bring her home. "I looked in that little girl's eyes," Patricia would say years later, "and part of me knew it was Lillian, but she didn't know me. She didn't remember anything, and the system said there wasn't enough evidence." The Tennessee lead eventually went cold when Henderson moved with Emma to an unknown location in 1989, and despite attempts to track them down, they seemed to vanish into the vastness of America, where people could disappear if they tried hard enough. The years accumulated slowly for Patricia Moore, with 1987 becoming 2000, and then 2010, and Lillian's room remained exactly as it had been the morning of the farmer's market, frozen in time with toys and clothes waiting for a girl who never came home. Age progression photos were created showing what Lillian might look like at 16, then 25, then 35, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as technology advanced. Patricia never married or had other children, unable to move forward from September 3, 1987, when she'd turned away for 15 seconds and lost her daughter forever in a crowded market. She became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations to improve Amber Alert systems and pushing for better security at public events, channeling her grief into activism that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Detective James Harrison took over the cold case in 2015, and he was struck by the Tennessee lead from 1988 that had never been fully resolved, and he wondered what had happened to the girl called Emma, who disappeared with Carol Henderson. Harrison used modern databases and social media to try tracking Henderson and Emma, but they'd effectively vanished after 1989, with no social security records, no driver's licenses, nothing that indicated where they'd gone or what names they might be using. By 2020, Lillian would have been 39 years old, possibly with a career and family of her own, and Patricia held memorial services each September 3rd, though she'd never truly accepted that her daughter was dead. True crime podcasts discovered Lillian's case in the late 2010s, and several shows featured episodes about the farmer's market disappearance and the suspicious Tennessee adoption that had never been properly investigated. In March 2024, a woman named Emma Richardson living in Oregon contacted Kentucky State Police after listening to a podcast about Lillian Moore's disappearance and experiencing a shocking moment of recognition. Emma, now 43 years old and working as a teacher in Portland, had grown up believing she'd been adopted by Carol Henderson from a birth mother who couldn't care for her, the story she'd been told repeatedly throughout her childhood. But the podcast had included details about Mr. Buttons the stuffed rabbit, and Patricia's description of the pink overalls Lillian had been wearing, and something about these specifics had triggered fragmented memories Emma couldn't explain. "I've always had these vague impressions of a different life before I was with Carol," Emma told Detective Sarah Chen, who'd taken over the cold case. "Images of a woman who wasn't Carol and a place that wasn't Tennessee, but I assumed they were dreams or imagination." Emma explained that Carol Henderson had died in 2018 from cancer, and while sorting through her belongings, Emma had found documents that raised questions about the adoption story she'd been told her entire life. The documents included newspaper clippings about missing children from the 1980s, and one clipping was about Lillian Moore's disappearance from the Hazard Farmers Market, hidden in a box in Henderson's attic with no explanation for why she'd kept it. Detective Chen immediately requested that Emma provide DNA for comparison against Patricia Moore's genetic profile, which had been entered into databases years earlier when the technology became available. The DNA analysis took 6 weeks, and when results came back in May 2024, they showed a 99.97% probability that Emma Richardson was biologically Lillian Moore, the child who disappeared 37 years earlier from a Kentucky market. The confirmation that Emma Richardson was Lillian Moore sent shockwaves through the cold case community and made international headlines. A missing child found alive after 37 years living under a different identity. Patricia Moore, now 68 and in declining health, received the call from Detective Chen on a Tuesday morning and collapsed sobbing in her kitchen, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't process after nearly 4 decades of grief. "My baby is alive," Patricia kept repeating through tears. "Lillian is alive. She's been alive this whole time. Oh God, she's alive and I'm going to see her again." The revelation was equally earth-shattering for Emma, who had to reconcile the fact that she was Lillian Moore, that she'd been stolen from a loving mother, and that her entire identity had been built on a kidnapping. "I don't know how to process this," Emma told her husband through tears. "I'm 43 years old. I've lived my entire conscious life as Emma Richardson, and now I'm being told I'm someone else and my first 6 years were stolen." Detective Chen handled the situation with extraordinary sensitivity, connecting Emma with therapists who specialized in recovered missing persons, and the complex trauma of discovering your childhood was based on a crime. The meeting between Emma and Patricia was arranged for June 2024 at a neutral location with counselors present, and both women approached the reunion with decades of grief and loss creating overwhelming emotions. Patricia recognized elements of Lillian in Emma's face despite 37 years of aging, and she brought childhood photos to show Emma the little girl she'd been before Carol Henderson had taken her. "I'm sorry I looked away," Patricia said through tears. "I was 3 feet from you just answering a question for 15 seconds and someone took you, and I've blamed myself every single day for 37 years. Emma looked at photos of herself as Lillian, seeing the pink overalls and Mr. Buttons the stuffed rabbit, and she felt fragments of memory stirring, though most of her early childhood remained frustratingly inaccessible. "This isn't your fault," Emma told Patricia gently. "You were being a mother, shopping at a market. You couldn't have known someone was watching and waiting for that exact moment to strike." The two women embraced crying, strangers connected by biology and tragedy, beginning the difficult process of building a relationship across 37 years of separation and fundamentally different life experiences. Detective Chen's investigation confirmed that Carol Henderson had been at the Hazard Farmers Market on September 3, 1987, though she'd lived in Tennessee and had no apparent connection to Kentucky or Patricia Moore. Henderson's background revealed that she'd suffered a miscarriage in 1986 and had become increasingly unstable, fixating on having a child and eventually deciding to take one rather than pursue legal adoption channels. She'd apparently traveled to Kentucky specifically looking for an opportunity, and when she'd seen Patricia distracted at the produce stand with Lillian standing nearby, she'd acted on impulse born from months of planning. Henderson had grabbed Lillian, carried her quickly through the alley to her car parked nearby, and driven immediately back to Tennessee before any alert could be issued or roadblocks established. Over the following months, Henderson had convinced Lillian that she was her mother, that her previous memories were dreams, and she'd moved repeatedly to prevent anyone from questioning the child's origins. The fraudulent adoption documents Henderson had shown investigators in 1988 were sophisticated enough to pass initial scrutiny, but would have been exposed as fake if DNA testing had been available at the time. Emma's memories of the abduction and the months after were largely gone, likely suppressed due to trauma and the manipulation by Henderson, who'd worked to erase Lillian's past and create a new identity as Emma. "Carol wasn't cruel to me," Emma explained to investigators. "She raised me with love and gave me a good life. But that doesn't change the fact that she stole me from my real mother and robbed me of my first 6 years." The realization that investigators in 1988 had been right to suspect Emma was Lillian, but couldn't prove it without DNA technology, was difficult for everyone involved, especially Patricia, who'd known in her heart but hadn't been believed. "The system failed us," Patricia told reporters. "They had Lillian right there in 1988, and they let Carol Henderson take her and disappear, and I lost 36 more years with my daughter because the technology didn't exist yet to prove the truth." Emma chose to embrace both identities, legally becoming Emma Lillian Richardson Moore, honoring the life she'd lived while reclaiming the name and heritage that had been stolen from her. She established a foundation to help other families of long-term missing children, focusing specifically on cases where DNA testing could potentially identify people who'd been taken as children and raised under false identities. The resolution of Lillian's case made international headlines throughout 2024, a story of hope that captured hearts worldwide, proving that even after 37 years, stolen children could be found alive and reunited with families. Emma traveled to Kentucky in July 2024 to see the town where she'd been born and the farmer's market location where she'd been taken, standing on Main Street trying to connect with memories that remained frustratingly out of reach. Patricia showed Emma her childhood bedroom that had been preserved for 37 years, and while Emma couldn't remember living there, she felt overwhelming emotion seeing the toys and clothes chosen for a 6-year-old who'd never come home to use them. Mr. Buttons, the stuffed rabbit that had been found at the market and preserved as evidence, was returned to Emma, and while she didn't consciously remember the toy, she found herself clutching it and feeling inexplicable comfort. The two women spent weeks getting to know each other, sharing stories about their lives and navigating the complexity of a mother-daughter relationship that had been interrupted for nearly 4 decades. Emma introduced Patricia to her 2 teenage children, Patricia's grandchildren who'd grown up not knowing they had a biological grandmother in Kentucky, who'd been searching for their mother. "I miss so much," Patricia said while meeting her grandchildren. "I missed watching Lillian grow up, graduate, get married, have these beautiful children, but I'm grateful I get to know them now and be part of their lives going forward." Emma's husband supported her journey, though he admitted the situation was surreal, learning that the woman he'd married had a completely different identity for her first 6 years and a mother who'd never stopped searching. The case brought renewed attention to the vulnerability of children in public spaces and the sophistication some abductors use to blend in and appear normal, making detection nearly impossible in the moment. Kentucky passed legislation in 2024 requiring enhanced security protocols at farmers markets and public events, including mandatory surveillance cameras and better training for vendors on recognizing suspicious behavior. The law also mandated that DNA from all unidentified children in state custody be compared against missing persons databases, ensuring that situations like Emma's in 1988 couldn't happen again without immediate identification. Patricia and Emma developed a ritual of visiting the farmers market location every September 3rd, transforming the anniversary of tragedy into a celebration of survival and reunion. The city of Hazard installed a memorial at the location with Emma and Patricia's photo from their 2024 reunion, along with text explaining the case and encouraging vigilance. Lillian Moore, stolen 1987, found alive 2024, a testament to hope. Emma wrote a memoir about her experience discovering her true identity and reuniting with Patricia, and the book became a bestseller, inspiring other adults who'd been adopted under questionable circumstances to investigate their origins. Her story led to 3 other cases being solved in 2024 and 2025, as adults who'd wondered about their backgrounds used DNA testing and discovered they'd been missing children reported decades earlier. The foundation Emma established provided free DNA testing to anyone who suspected they might have been abducted as children, and within its first year, the organization had facilitated 5 reunions between missing persons and their families. Patricia lived to see not only Lillian found, but also the positive impact the case had on other families, and she told reporters that the 37 years of pain had been worth enduring to reach this moment. "I never gave up hope," Patricia said at a press conference. "Everyone told me to accept that Lillian was dead and move on, but I couldn't. I always believed she was out there somewhere, and I was right." The case proved that DNA technology can solve even the most impossible-seeming cases, and that adults living normal lives may have hidden pasts waiting to be discovered through genetic testing. Emma maintained her life in Oregon while building a relationship with Patricia in Kentucky, flying back quarterly to spend time with her biological mother and helping Patricia manage her declining health. "I have 2 lives now," Emma told a documentary filmmaker. "The life I lived as Emma Richardson for 37 years, which was real and valuable, and the life I should have had as Lillian Moore, which was stolen, but has been partially returned." The therapeutic process of integrating her 2 identities took years, and Emma worked with specialists who helped her understand that both Emma and Lillian were authentic parts of who she was, not competing identities but complementary pieces. Patricia died peacefully in 2027 at age 71, 3 years after being reunited with Lillian, and she died knowing that her daughter was alive, safe, and thriving, the answer to 37 years of prayers. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her daughter Lillian, found alive after decades of searching, and that she dedicated her life to advocating for missing children and never giving up hope. The story of Lillian Moore, stolen at age 6 from a Kentucky farmer's market and found 37 years later living as Emma Richardson in Oregon, stands as one of the most remarkable missing persons cases ever resolved. It demonstrates the power of DNA technology, the importance of never giving up on missing children, and the reality that people stolen as children and raised under false identities may not know their true origins. And in Hazard, Kentucky, where a little girl in pink overalls once stood beside her mother at a produce stand, her story lives on as inspiration that even after decades, hope can be rewarded and families can be reunited. The case reminds us that 6-year-olds should be safe at farmers markets, that 15 seconds of distraction is all an abductor needs, and that families deserve the truth no matter how many years have passed. Emma Lillian Richardson Moore continues her work helping other families while raising her own children and maintaining her relationship with Patricia's memory and the Kentucky community that never forgot Lillian. Mr. Buttons, the stuffed rabbit that had been evidence for 37 years, now sits in Emma's home office, a tangible connection to the little girl she was and the mother who never stopped searching for her.